Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs, and today I'd like to welcome David Zinner. Thank you very much for coming, David. David's going to talk to us about a Hever Kadisha, and I guess my first question better be, what's a Hever Kadisha?
Well, thanks for having me. Hever Kadisha is an old Jewish institution that was mentioned in Talmudic discussions, but has really become more active and more something that we have records of, starting in maybe the 1300s out of Spain and then into the 1600s out of Prague and Germany. The Hever Kadisha means Holy Society. It's it's a volunteer group usually of people who are very dedicated to their work, and they work in the areas of death and mourning. They may have traditionally done things from managing a cemetery, taking care of the body of a person after they die, to do ritual washing and purification and dressing. They may also get involved with comforting mourners and possibly even visiting people when they're seriously ill. So it's a large continuum of potential care that the Hever Kadisha participates in, but not all Hever Kadishas do everything.
Well, I know in the course of many of these shows we've said that Hever Kadishas have records and stuff like that. Did all Hever Kadisha have records, or what kind of records do they have?
It really depends on how they're organized. Some Hever Kadishas have very extensive records, especially the older ones. In the United States and in North America, Hever Kadishas tend not to keep records and rely on the funeral homes they work from to do the record keeping.
Okay, so you're actually working with funeral homes.
Usually. There are some Hever Kadishas that have their own funeral home. They have their own facility where they do washing, and they may even have a chapel. So, for example, in Winnipeg, the Chesed Shel Emes has their own building. They have their own staff. They do all the Jewish funerals in town. They're owned by the synagogues in the community, and they work closely with the Jewish cemeteries. And so there they would be a central record-keeping source. But in most communities in the United States, the Hever Kadisha works out of one or a number of funeral homes. So they may not have any records at all, or they may have some records. It'll vary quite a bit.
Would you always be working with a Jewish funeral home?
Not necessarily. There's a number of different ways this could develop. For example, in small communities, there may not be a funeral home which traditionally serves Jews, but if there's a small community, they may have formed a relationship with a funeral home that has no connection with Judaism, but does offer services to the Jewish community.
So they'll let you come in and sit with the body and things that our religion requires that other people perhaps don't do.
That's right. And it's really important that the Hever Kadisha in town works out a relationship with the funeral homes that it might be going to. Even in a large city, a Jewish family could decide to have a funeral at a funeral home that knows nothing about Jewish traditions. So it's important that the Hever Kadisha talk to people from those different funeral homes to work out things so that we can have access and we can have use of the facility, and that there's a cordial working relationship.
Now, is a Hever Kadisha something a family would join and like pay a monthly fee so that when the time comes, you would take care of everything? Or is it something that they would contact you, oh, somebody's died?
There are a number of different models. The traditional model for the Landsmannschaft is that you would join and pay
let me
dues.
say let's explain the term Landsmannschaft. It's
Okay.
a group that immigrants belong to that generally were people from their own village or town or area, so they had something in common with them.
Right, and they would often charge dues, a monthly dues or an annual dues, and people would have a right to space in a cemetery and to the access to the Hever Kadisha as part of that package. A lot of the Landsmannschaft organizations don't exist anymore, or a new generation has taken them over, and they may not have the same structure. So in many cities, the Hever Kadisha is more of a service organization than a membership organization, where they are attached to a synagogue, or they're part of a community-wide organization, and the funeral home knows how to contact them. But there is an evolving model also of sort of a resurgence of that membership structure. So, for example, Tifereth Israel Congregation in Washington has a very interesting model where the Chaver Kadisha of the synagogue provides services to its members. That's very traditional. But what that synagogue does is, as part of your membership dues for belonging to the synagogue, you have a free funeral.
Oh, that's that's nice. Yeah,
so
those are expensive.
Very expensive, and so this does a number of things. One is it directs the buying power of the synagogue to help keep the prices low, and it also builds loyalty among members because no one wants to leave their synagogue and give up their free funeral.
Oh, that's very interesting. Then let's say if somebody knew that somebody died in that town, one of the things they could do is try to see if there was an old Chaver Kadisha from that town. Is there any kind of a comprehensive list or anything like? I know that the cemetery project exists on the part of Jewish Gin, and I was instrumental in getting that going. But that's not even that up to date anymore. That's already been about 8 years since I was running it. What would they do? Is there a separate Chaver Kadisha list? Because I don't think I had those listed.
There's not a good comprehensive Chaver Kadisha list. Chaver Kadishas, for the most part, are organizations that don't have a building, that don't have staff, usually run by volunteers, and they're sometimes difficult to locate. Usually funeral homes, Jewish funeral homes that work with Jewish funerals and burials, are able to contact a Chaver Kadisha, but even they don't necessarily know where they all are. So there isn't a central way to identify them. But there is an evolving movement to try to coordinate Chaver Kadisha work. The organization that I'm the executive director of, KAVOD NICHUM, we maintain a list that we don't publish of contact information for Chavers all over the U.S. and Canada. And certainly if someone called us or went to our website, they would be able to get in touch with us and we would be able to direct them.
Now there is I think you mentioned there's a growing movement towards a centralized sort of listing of Jewish cemeteries in the U.S.?
There's a new organization called the Jewish Cemetery Association of North America, which is sort of on the verge of going public. This is an organization of mainly nonprofit Jewish cemeteries that want to network together and coordinate their efforts. And this is a very exciting development because there has never been anything, believe it or not, to connect Jewish cemeteries. Just like there had never been anything to connect Chaver Kadisha groups. They cropped up in each city and each community, but they never networked. Unlike, for example, rabbis, cantors, educators. Every Jewish profession you can name has a network, except for cemeteries and Chaver Kadisha groups, which now are starting to do that.
Well, many of the synagogues will own a plot of land too, and then you buy it as you need it from them, and then sometimes they're completely separate, sometimes they're within a city or town cemetery, and it's really sort of hard to find where they're located if you're doing genealogy research.
Right. Well, the resource you developed with the cemetery listing is still the best resource for that, and I use it all the time. But it does need to be updated, and I'm hoping that someone will follow in your footsteps to work on that.
Yeah, well, as soon as we heard about one, we used to, make 15, 20 updates a year, and I'm not really sure who's in charge of it now. So how can a cemetery help a genealogist? I mean, the individual cemeteries have listings, and the funeral homes have listings of the people. This is something that I picked up when in Chicago. It's called Memorial Prayers and Calendar, but this lists some of the. If you contact something like this is Pizer in I think of it as Chicago, but this particular address is Skokie. They've got several locations, and they can look up and see if they handled a funeral for a family group. I know my own family, like you said, that Chaver Kadisha will contract with different ones, and it seemed like those in my family where everybody was a different funeral home, whoever they happened to contact or could handle it. again, because Jewish funerals have to be so quick that if someone is busy, they could use another one.
Right. Well, also, Jewish funeral homes have gone through quite the change over the last 25 or 30 years. There's been a lot of foment in the industry where big corporate conglomerates took over funeral homes. A lot of them that used to be owned by a Jewish entrepreneur, where they sold out to the conglomerate and they maintained their name on it, but there was no longer really any connection to Jewish ownership. They still served the Jewish community. And then some of those have been bought back, and so there's been combinations and recombinations. And so the funeral home that was there, a while back may not be there, or it may not be owned by the same people, or they may have moved. There's been a lot of transitions.
If you can't find we've been to a couple of cemeteries, which I was surprised at how well their computer files were. I mean, they could tell you exactly where the person was located, and it went very, very quickly when I expected they'd have to go through files of cards to try and find somebody.
Well, one of the reasons that cemeteries have gotten themselves organized and a little more computerized is I think a lot of them were scared by what happened in South Florida with Menorah Gardens, where a number of years back, the SCI, which owned the cemetery at the time, was accused of mishandling bodies and not keeping good records and a number of other things. And there was a large settlement, $100 million settlement.
Wow.
So this is the kind of thing that catches a cemetery's attention. And
well, the other one was in New York, where they were trying to do reburials in the area. There was the poor Pottersfield,
right.
And they were saying nobody was buried there when people knew that they had an ancestor that was buried there.
Right.
So
right. Yeah. So for example, the chain that owned that cemetery in South Florida has gone to all its cemeteries, and they've done remapping and regridding and worked very hard on getting their computerized records up to date. And I think other cemeteries see that as more of a priority, that they really have to be well organized.
Yeah, well, it certainly helps if somebody's looking for something.
Well, it's interesting because it not only helps the genealogist, but it also gives an opening for the genealogist to help the cemetery, because when genealogists say to cemeteries, you really need to get your records organized, this is not adequate, the cemeteries hear that enough, maybe they'll start believing it.
Well, if the records aren't, you don't like that cemetery, the records aren't organized, it comes time to bury your parents, you're not going to choose that cemetery if you have a choice about it.
Right, but once you have someone buried there, then you can't go anywhere else. So you really have to put pressure on them. It's interesting what's happening with cemeteries is that, when cemeteries are no longer able to manage their cemetery, when the boards of volunteers are no longer able to keep it up, in some communities they formed federations of Jewish cemeteries, like in Boston and now one in Baltimore and a number of other cities, so that when a cemetery is struggling, that federation can pick up and make sure that things are taken care of. So,
and you're getting that more and more in more of the big cities?
I think it's a trend, and I think it's going to continue. There's a lot of responsibility here, and the Jewish community needs to make sure that this continues to happen. One of the problems that I see two major problems in the cemetery world. One is that the small Jewish cemeteries owned by a synagogue or a Landsmannschaft don't have the volunteer power to keep managing them. So we need to either invigorate that or to move them under umbrella groups. And the second big problem we have in Jewish cemeteries is we have corporate ownership where they have no real concept of the long-term importance that a Jewish cemetery carries to the Jewish people. And eventually we, the Jews who live in North America, need to proactively bring those cemeteries back under Jewish communal control.
Yes, I was very surprised when I visited cemeteries in Europe, not Jewish cemeteries. They just do reburials automatically. They just, if 20 years are up, that's it. The grave is reused. And somebody told me, well, I've got to keep paying this, otherwise I can't eventually be buried, so I've got to pay till I'm dead 20 years. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't happen in the United States. I was so shocked when and there were other places, little tiny cemeteries. Oh, they automatically bury them and they throw the bones down this hole, and what?
That's sort of interesting because, you know, in the old days in the Middle East, when they did burials, they did cave burials, and they, you know, when you say the phrase "gathered to your ancestors,"
oh yeah,
they literally gathered the bones and put them in a bone box until the next burial.
Yeah.
So, and the other interesting flip side of what you were saying before is that, you know, for example, in Germany, where many of the Jewish cemeteries seem to be maintained by non-Jews, where there's not a Jewish community, with potential government support. I'm not sure how much government support, but there seems to be a lot of care exercised by people who are maintaining Jewish cemeteries in Germany who aren't Jewish.
I don't want to say guilt, but it could, because it's the next generation. But is it guilt because of what their parents had done or so? But yes,
it's a feeling of responsibility in some ways.
Of responsibility of what had been done. Yeah, we did one on Bad Arolsen. That was one of the locations where they're doing it, and that was one of the real Nazi. That was the Nazi.
Yeah, when my mother and I went back to Germany, we went to maybe 13 cemeteries in a week, and you know, almost consistently there was someone caring for them, especially some of the really small ones that went to a town called Zeltingen, and it was up. You know, we couldn't find the cemetery, and we found this really old guy who said he would take us up there, and he went winding through the vineyards up to the top of the hill, and it was nicely taken care of. And he said on Kristallnacht, they especially come out and force and guard it to make sure nothing happens. So it was a pretty different kind of feeling for my mother going back after all those years.
Yeah, we've visited quite a few in Germany too, and they, for the most part, seem to be kept up, except you know, I've heard also from a few people that said there was nothing left. So it really depended on which little town you were at and how accessible. You know, if it's up in the mountains, it's less likely to be destroyed. What about other records of some of these old places? I think particularly in some of the places in Germany, the local people are writing down the names on the tombstones as much as they can read. If they're all Hebrew, they can't read it. But I found in Germany a lot, they're often both languages, both Hebrew and German, so that they can copy down the names. Some of those are being placed on the web. I don't know whether they've been added to the Jobar on Jewish Gen or not. But many of those are beginning to become available. I don't know about other countries. What about in this country, in the towns that have disappeared? Because we have towns, particularly in the South, in the United States, where they're no longer Jews. Right,
and in the Midwest, where there's areas where there's not heavy Jewish populations, there is great potential for partnership between genealogy societies and cemetery volunteers folks who manage cemetery boards. You know, there's great opportunity to work together and to, you know, cooperate on that kind of effort.
The trouble is, because there's no money, the Jewish community there's no volunteers there either, because you know, they lived there for some 100 years or 50 years, or from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s perhaps, but slowly everybody's migrated out of there, and there just isn't that presence anymore. And a lot of these very small ones are disappearing. And that was one of the things that prompted part of the cemetery project, is to try to find these before they disappear completely.
Right.
And one of the things we did talk about before is if somebody does find a cemetery, particularly these small ones that tend to disappear, get the coordinates, the GPS coordinates, and then at least you'll know this is the location where the cemetery was, whether anything is standing anymore.
And take pictures, and you know, it's really interesting now because you're able, even with a small little cemetery, you can record the information, but you can also link pictures to a database so that you can click on a record and see the picture of the tombstone, and you know, people shouldn't wait until all the volunteers disappear. You know, if you have a cemetery and you have volunteers, you know, record it as quickly as you can.
Well, even here in this metropolitan area, some years ago, JGSGW, Jewish Genealogy Society of Greater Washington, indexed the old Washington Hebrew and Adas Israel records. because those were neglected. It was the old part of the cemetery. Nobody bothered going back there. Nobody had a complete listing. So even in a metropolitan area like this, where they're old where the old part seems to be left, and
right.
Nobody.
And those two cemeteries that you mentioned are in Southeast, and there's a contiguous plot of land that has 4 cemeteries on it. So Ohev Shalom is on the 3rd part, and then the 4th part is Elis Vatgrad, which is a cemetery which again is made up of 5 different organizations, one being the old DC Lodge, and then 4 other congregations, one of which is Tefereth Israel, where I'm also the executive director. So one of the things that we did was we took the old Elis Vatgrad cemetery records, which were all on little index cards, and we hired someone to basically transcribe them and put them into a computerized record so we could search them. So when people call up now, we can easily find them, and we can have that out there at the cemetery when people come to visit.
Why don't you give your web page again, and Sid will put it up on.
Okay, the website's Jewish Funerals, Burial, and Mourning, and it's at www.jewish- it's like a little dash, funerals.org. And this site's been up for about 10 years. We've had about 750,000 visitors, and we have about 1,200 pages of links, 1,200 links to other pages, and about 400 or 500 pages of material on the site. So it's fairly extensive. It covers everything that we can put together on any aspect of Jewish funerals or burial or mourning issues. For example, we'll have a page on suicide, how Jews used to treat suicides, how we've evolved thinking about suicide burials, suicide prevention, other information like that, or a page on yahrzeit, and what are the traditions around yahrzeit, where are yahrzeit calculators available, things like that.
We need to explain the term yahrzeit. It literally means time of year, so it's the yearly day that we remember our departed and say a special prayer for them on that day.
Right.
And you can always, I guess you have a calendar?
Well, we have links to calendars. It's amazing what you can find out on the internet.
Oh yeah, they have a very good.
We try not to replicate what's out there, but instead try and be a single source where people can go to find information to get everything. One of the most interesting parts of our website are 35 Tahara stories. Tahara is the ritual washing and purification of a Jewish person after they die, and it's very similar to the Muslim ritual and to rituals in a number of other religions where washing and prayers are done after a person dies. But what's so interesting is we have these first-person accounts of people talking about the work, and you think you're going to read about, first I washed the arm and then I washed the leg and that kind of stuff. Instead, what you read about is very interesting. It's like this spiritual experience that people have. It's very transformative, very powerful, about how they were afraid and they didn't know what was going to happen, but then they go in there and it's like overwhelming. They are able to do it even though they may have no medical training or whatever, but it changes them. It changes the way they think about Judaism, the way they think about themselves, and most importantly, it changes the way they think about life, because it makes them appreciate life. When there's nothing like encountering someone who's dead to make you appreciate the people who are living.
Well, it's always been considered a mitzvah, translate that for me quick.
Well, it's a commandment, but it's really interpreted as a good deed.
A good deed to do something like that. So that's why these people have volunteered over the generations to do that kind of thing.
And some are motivated just by that alone. Others are motivated because of other reasons. For example, their grandparents did it, and it's a tradition in their family. Or other people because they have unresolved issues of their own, and this helps them work it through. Maybe, one of the biggest things that I hear is I didn't get to go to my grandmother's funeral, kind of thing. And so I never got to say goodbye. Well, but I said goodbye to 100 other grandmothers, and so that helps me deal with the issue that I didn't get to do that.
I also want to mention that at the website for this TV show, tracingroots.nova.org, we will have a link to your site, and if they forget that or they didn't write it down fast enough watching the show, they can always get it through that and then link to you and then to all of the other sites. Now, do you have any kinds of, you don't do any collection of names though on your web pages, do you? Or?
We don't. We don't collect data, but we
tell you where to look for it?
Well, we're certainly sensitive to genealogy. I mean, you know, I've been doing genealogy research on my own family for quite a while, and I help cemeteries figure out ways to make that information available, and I do classes for cemetery managers on how to make genealogy information available. But we're not really a source for names.
But you'll help, you sort of direct people where to go.
I'd be glad to direct people, yes.
What else? Let's say, how is a Jewish cemetery different from the other one? I mean, we've talked about the fact that they're forever, as opposed to anything else. I know they're always separated.
Right. Well, a Jewish cemetery is interesting because it is really part of the religious community. The Jewish cemetery is traditionally consecrated in a ceremony, usually with an organization, often with a rabbi, but there's a ceremony to say that this is the Jewish cemetery. These are its boundaries, these are its rules, this is how it will operate. So it's more like equivalent of like dedicating or consecrating a synagogue or a mikveh or something like that, where you're saying this area is set aside, it's special place. And then, you know, in some communities, they can't afford to buy their own cemetery. They use part of a larger cemetery space, but they demarcate it in some way, either with a fence or a path or hedges or something.
Something so you know that
Right.
is the section.
Yes.
That's separate. I've seen it both with fences, inside of fences. I've seen ultra-Orthodox have a separate section within the Jewish cemetery with big walls, in fact, in order to make sure that everybody realized it was separate. Well, this has been very interesting, and I appreciate your coming in. Thank you very much. And I think we learned a little bit about cemeteries and burial practices and how to find out about it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.